I'm Brian Hiatt. This is Rolling Stone Music Now. I have a very special episode for you today. Tuesday, June 4th is the 40th anniversary of Bruce Springsteen's Born in the U.S.A., one of the biggest albums of all time. To celebrate that anniversary, I have with me two musicians who played on that album. From the E Street Band, keyboardist Roy Bittan and drummer Max Weinberg. One thing you probably really need to know going into these interviews is something you may already know, which is that Bruce's 1982 solo acoustic album, Nebraska, is deeply tied into Born USA, which came out 2 years later. The Born in the USA sessions began in 1982 with efforts to make full band versions of the Nebraska songs. Let's start out with my conversation with Roy Bittan, and then we'll hear from Max Weinberg. Because it comes up a couple times in these interviews, a reminder that I do have a book called Bruce Springsteen, The Stories Behind the Songs, that tells the stories of the songs on Born in the USA and all of Bruce's other albums. And there's also a new book out called There Was Nothing You Could Do, Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA and the End of the Heartland. That's really good. It's by a friend of the pod, Stephen Hayden, and we'll actually have an interview with him coming up in a future episode. You should check that out as well. But again, here's my conversation with Roy Bittan of the E Street Band. So it's been 40 years since the release of Born in the USA.
It's a dreamlike quality to all of this. 40 years, when you just consider it's almost half a century. I don't think we ever envisioned that 40 years later, we would be looking back and talking about this moment in time.
And here you are still on the road 40 years later.
Yeah, that's true. That's certainly true. It's not only is it 40 years later, but I think we're having a better time now than we ever did.
And I guess you took your time off and went home briefly.
Yes. We decided, Susan and I, my wife and I were over there and trying to decide what to do. And we said, okay, let's just make the long haul back to California, which it's quite a trek from where we were in Prague. We were in Prague, but I'm glad we did. It's always great to come home, even though unexpectedly. But it is a bit of, I always call it existential whiplash, because all of a sudden I'm home and I'm not playing in front of 60,000 people, and I'm going out for a container of milk, back to the mundane, which I have no problem.
And it's funny, if we look at the Born in the USA story, which you and I have talked about before for my book, but this is a little different. If you look at the story of Born in the USA, it really starts with the end of the River Tour. So it's a similar transition for you, really. September 14th, 1981 was the final date of the River Tour, and then you guys went home.
Yes, that tour and that album was just a real high point, I think, of live recording with the band and just great days in the studio. A lot of hard work, as it always has been. It was a lot of hours, a lot of range work, Bruce working on his songs. It was just an incredible period of activity. And then suddenly you go back to your house and it's always dreamlike. It really is.
So what happened was Bruce goes back and he's off writing and recording solo, famously with a Tascam 4-track during that period, up until the end of that year, 1981. At some point, according to Max, the first rehearsal, the first time the band convened since the River Tour, was in your living room.
I had a home that was a very contemporary home, and my living room was literally wood, brick, and huge glass windows. And so we set up in there, and the sound of it was fantastic. And we went through a bunch of the Nebraska songs, preparing to go to the recording studio. And my recollection was that the versions were really fantastic. Of course, I haven't heard them since, I think, 1981, so I could be totally wrong about that. But we did go in the studio at some point after that, and I think we tried recording, but Bruce had caught something very unusual just purely by using the Tascam that he did in his room and the intimacy of it and being by himself. And as usual, when you make a demo, the recording process is always beat the demo. Even if those recordings were excellent and could have comprised an album, I think the vibe that he had on his little set was something to reckon with. So I guess in the end, I guess it turned out that he chose what he did in his bedroom. But I'm dying to hear the recordings from the studio. And there may even be a cassette somewhere that has the rehearsal tapes from my living room.
Max apparently still does have that recording. But amazingly, with all the stuff that's been released, the quote unquote Electric Nebraska versions still, the world has not heard them, or the band for that matter, apparently.
Exactly. It's eluded us. Maybe Bruce at some point will get into that.
At some point, the sessions did take a shift. This other material that was different from what was on the Nebraska tape started to be introduced. Do you remember that shift?
From my point of view, what I remember, strictly from my narrow point of view, was that I decided that I would try and introduce synthesizers.
Right.
So I think what the break for me, what you're describing, is that I came into the studio with a Yamaha CS80.
Right.
Which did not engender a lot of warmth from the rest of the band.
You said it was like you killed someone when you brought that synthesizer in.
It was a funny thing because synthesizers were being used so much in pop music at that particular moment that there was a reactionary effect of seeing one of those things in the flesh. But what I recognized was me. It's always been, Bruce, give me a lyric sheet before we record the song. I want to know what the song is about. This day, he does do that, but it's always been paramount for me, being the instrument in the band that I think was the most interpretive of his songs. So anyway, I recognize that synthesizer could very possibly just broaden the landscape for him in creating a backdrop for his lyrics. Because you can talk about a rock band, you can talk about rock songs and all this stuff, but when you're talking about Bruce, you have to remember that he's poet. If you lose sight of that, then you're missing the big picture here. So anyway, so once I brought that in, I think we started working on songs. And don't ask me which one we worked on first. Maybe Max knows. But that for me was the start of Born in the U.S.A. And actually, if you listen to the album, some of the most, my hometown, Downbound Train, even Born in the U.S.A., which evokes, I tried to evoke some type of Asian instrumental, something evocative of that. And I played, I think, a lot more synthesizer on that album than I did actual piano.
Of course, I'm on Fire is another great example.
Oh, of course, I'm on fire. That was a funny bit because I think what happened was I needed to take a bathroom break. So I ran in and I was gone for a couple of minutes. And when I came back, Bruce was playing that figure on his guitar. And I don't think Gary was in the room. I think there was no bass. And Max was playing the drums. And I heard that. And I went over to the synthesizer because I had heard the song before, and I started to play that melodic line, which is basically the intro to the song. Excuse me. And that's pretty much how that song exists on the album.
And then, of course, in later years, it's become one of the most famous and most covered and most played on streaming Bruce songs, and it all came together in 3 minutes.
Yeah. A lot of songs came together very quickly. That was one of the beautiful characteristics of our band. We were very reactive and emotional and creative all at once in a very short time.
Do you think you played any synth on the Nebraska songs?
I think I played all piano. The first synthesizer I had was CS80, which is a huge, big, heavy beast. And I don't remember having that in my living.
So you wouldn't have introduced something that you hadn't rehearsed, basically, because you would rehearsed it one way in your living room. You wouldn't have suddenly brought in the synth and changed what you rehearsed, is what you're saying.
I think that's probably a good assumption.
Now, one thing people need to understand is that there wasn't really a clear line between a lot of this material. For example, the song Born USA was recorded in the quote unquote Nebraska session. But was there any line that was clear between the stuff you were working on?
No, I don't think the line was clear for Bruce. I think he was in writing mode. And I think writing mode for him is let's see what comes out. And then after I see what comes out, I'll look at it in total. And when I feel like I've gone as far as I can, or find the vein in the mind. And then he tries to figure out what's the best way to present what I was doing during this period of writing.
And what's funny is, in addition to the Nebraska stuff and the released songs on Born USA, of course, there's all these outtakes. You were also recording things like My Love Will Not Let You Down.
Just, we used to say, oh, these are all number one songs if they were released in that form. And that's the thing. That's why I say, I don't think he had a clear idea himself. I think he would write in a direction and then something else would come out and he'd write in that direction. And then eventually he would find the thing that he wanted to say and damn the rest of the songs, whether they were number one hits or not.
An album track like Darlington County, do you have any memories of recording that?
Again, you're talking about probably 70 something songs. I think we probably recorded in total for all of that, Nebraska and U.S.A. I have vague memories of the studio and where my piano was day after day. So remembering a specific song sometimes is difficult because they're all the same. It's just different chords. I'm in the same spot.
It does feel like the title track of Born USA stood out to you immediately as a memory and as something special.
Yeah, Born in the USA. Okay, so I think Max and I have slightly different together. Max seems to think that he started playing. First of all, Bruce played us the song on his acoustic guitar. That's the first thing I remember, because he oftentimes did that most of the time. And then I had my CS80 there, and I think at first Max was playing around with his drums a little bit, and then he may have started playing a beat that would have been a tempo for that song. And meanwhile, I was fooling with my CS80. It was, in some ways, it was a crude instrument because it had these toggle switches. I think there were 4 toggle switches, and it opened and closed filters. And that's how you adjust or change your sound. The funny part about it wasn't a stepped toggle switch. You just moved it, and good luck getting it back to where it was the day before, because there's no way to know unless you wanted a chalk mark next to it. It's actually a very funny thing that they did. I'll never understand how they could create an instrument like that was so advanced, but yet they couldn't figure out how to make the dial work in an exacting manner. Anyway, so I had this idea I knew what the lyrics were, and I had this idea about maybe trying to get some strange sound that was evocative of Asia or whatever. And so I had this funny little sound, and I will say Max was playing, and then I went on the synthesizer. So I had that low note, and I had the little melody figure on top. I did that to the tempo I think that Max was playing. I'm using Max's version. I'm incorporating Max's version in it. I'm playing to Max. Of course, I contended years ago that I played that first, and then he came in on the drums. But either way, it was the synergy of Max and myself, I think. And when Bruce heard the two of us, he said, wait a second, stop. Let's try it like that. And then the rest is sort of history. I think we played a couple of takes, and that was the end of it. We had it.
That low drone, I think it's the B note, is so key to the thing, the ominousness of that. And then the little riff, and it's incredible. I mean, obviously you're a very gifted musician who's played some very complicated things, but that was very simple. And you stuck with the simple riff throughout.
Yeah. The song's only 2 chords.
Right.
So it just didn't, it's a funny thing. It just instinctually sometimes you can't be afraid to be primitive, so to speak. And for us, we grew up with basic rock and roll, which everybody jokes, oh, it's 3 chords, you can play rock and roll. And there is some truth to that in the sense that you can do an awful lot with 3 chords. To be able to just get right down into your gut and just lay into 2 chords and 1 riff. It's just the element. It's elemental rock and roll. Now, fact that I was using a synthesizer is almost irrelevant. I could have been playing that on the piano in the same way. Yeah. I think, in a way, I think we pride ourselves on being able to lower, so to speak, our musicianship, which is how some people probably would have described early rock and roll as being the lowest level of musicianship. But it's so much more, obviously.
Something like Downbound Train is a great example of how there really was no line between these two things, because it was actually on the Nebraska tape. There is a Nebraska version of it, and yet it became this great Born USA track. And again, a great use of synthesizer on that, especially in the breakdown. It's basically just synth and voice. It's such a striking moment and groundbreaking at that point for Bruce. And that synth bed sound is something I think he's come back to so many times. It's a sound he learned to love, and I think that's where you first gave it to him.
Yeah, yeah. On that song in particular, it was extremely effective because just the nature of the lyrics and the mournfulness of it. And bed, again, was what I had in mind when I said that I could broaden the landscape. But also, that thing can provide stillness, and it could also provide a strange comfortableness too. There's a lot you could do with it if you're not using the sounds of the moment. In other words, the idea that I had was I can utilize this with Bruce, but it has to be more anonymous sounding rather than distinctive synthesizer Moog sound. So the idea was to use it as a backdrop for it. Then, of course, when we got to Dancing in the Dark, that was already the end of the album. Years of recording. And that was a very interesting moment because I remember when John Orlando called me up and said, come down to the studio. We have another song we want to work on. And I had just got the first Yamaha digital synthesizer. Of course, today is also extremely primitive and had all kinds of extra noise that bothered every engineer in the studio. But in any event, I was able to carry that under my arm. I remember I didn't even have a case for it. And we went into the studio and Bruce played me Dancing in the Dark. And I said, okay, here's some new sounds we have on this little synthesizer. And of course, so I did what kind of I did on I'm on Fire, which was I used the melody of his song and played it on the synthesizer.
As the intro.
Exactly. That was the hook. I was always good at finding the hook, my pop music background. And so I played that. And then it needed something else. And I remember I said, how about if I put a pulse on the bottom? And I played like an eighth note pulse. And then we really had a very modern sounding song. I think more modern than any of the other songs on the record. It clearly sounded more like a pop record when he played it for me. And I think what I did on the synthesizer pushed it in that direction. I tried to do that. I think that they were looking for at that moment when I think Sean had said to him, need a hit. I'm not sure any of the songs on this record. He wasn't sure that any of those songs were his number one hit.
The pad sound on Downbound Train, do you remember dialing that up? Was that hard to find?
No, I think that one was pretty simple because it was only Bruce, Gary, Max, and myself, I think, at that particular moment working on that song. It was very open. It was an easy sound to find. I think I actually had a preset sound. That was the other thing. That instrument had maybe 12 little buttons and you could hit combinations of them, but you couldn't really change the sound of them. But so I think I just hit a preset and it was dark and it sounded right.
And the Dancing in the Dark digital sound, I think you said was like a horn preset, and you found it pretty quickly.
Yeah, it was a horn preset, but it wasn't really, it wasn't a trumpet. It sounded like a synthesizer.
Right.
It actually did. And it was a little bit on the dark side, which I felt was good. And it was just, again, it was one of those things where I pressed a button and it sounded right. I would just press buttons and something sounded right.
Was Bruce instantly comfortable with that thing? Because again, with Dancing in the Dark, it was notably modern, notably synthy, notably poppy. I guess that was what he was looking for, right?
I think that's what they were looking for. I think that after the massive amount of recording that he had done, I think he was looking for something that was really going to catch people's ears on the radio. And I was never really afraid to try something. I just figured if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Anyway, I think my instinct was right about it. And I think it was exciting, I think, when I did what I did, because there was an immediate transformation that moment into a record. And it's those moments that I look back on and I go, the culmination of a musician's experience sometimes displays itself just very succinctly at a particular moment. And that was one of those moments where it was just, I think, the right thing at the right moment.
Was there anyone out there using synthesizers in a way that you liked, in a way that inspired the way you used them at the time?
Well, really, at that time, which was, I guess, MTV was happening big time, very big time. And there was so many, oh my God, there was so many bands doing different things. But I don't really recall anybody, I don't really recall a rock band, a real rock band. There were many of pop music and a lot of Euro bands who were doing really extraordinary things with synthesizers. But so I took all of that in, and I think what I did was I said, that's not what we want to do. That's, as I said, I felt that we could use it in a more anonymous way.
And then when you went on tour with it, what were the challenges of trying for the first time to get those synth sounds live? Was that tricky?
The problem was they were finicky instruments, and the CS80 was analog, and weather seemed to affect it. So if we had a damp night in Germany, the dampness would seep into it and it would sound like out of tune. So I had two of them, and I had one. Every time one of them would start sounding really out of tune, I would go, give me the one in the box for the next show, and let's see how that sounds. Then they would put the first one away. And I think the first one would probably try out a little bit. And then eventually I'd go, this one's not sounding so good either. Get the first one back out. So we were like constantly switching him out. And we got through it. It worked. It worked enough.
It's really interesting. I'm sure you're aware that there's a whole new generation who try to chase down and try to emulate those synth sounds. They're trying to get that downbound train sound. I think Jack Antonoff, who does all of Taylor Swift's records, is really into the synth sounds that you and Bruce use, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it could be gotten, but a lot of it was, as I said, was look, everything becomes so exacting after a while. You forget that things in those days, and not only when we were doing it, but sometimes it's just the instinctive stuff is the process of discovery of just things like that just is done almost on a level of consciousness that's just slightly below an analytic intellectual decisions that one might make to produce sound. Good luck for anybody trying to get the exact sounds, because if it would probably be hard for me even to, if I was just presented with a sound and one of those instruments, to just try and figure out what it was.
I was asking Max about his memories of things like the Dancing in the Dark video, which you guys shot in St. Paul.
Oh, yeah. Big theater, and Courtney. It was an interesting approach and something different for us. I think it was the way it was staged was not probably quite our wheelhouse, but certainly had made a great impression on me. And of course, the song was so great that we probably could have done any number of different videos and had the same result.
It's probably true. Synthesizer issues aside, those 84 and 85 tours and the size of them, the ever increasing size and the ever increasing mania, were they fun for you?
Absolutely. It was a realization of a dream, I think. I mean, at that moment in time, we were probably the biggest band in the world. I think maybe arguably, but
Yeah.
I think certainly we were with the album and the tour. And when I was listening to Little Richard on my little transistor radio, and when I saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and blah, 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 on. And then to get to that point, it was certainly just an absolute amazing experience. And I'll never forget the end of that tour, Born in the USA tour. I think we played the Coliseum in Los Angeles, which was, I could be wrong on the number of people there. It might have been 64, 80,000, whatever it was. And we played there more than one night. I don't remember how many nights. Max knows all of this.
Yeah.
I'm sure. But I remember that from the stage, when we finished, we walked a big flight of steps to these arches. And I remember I got to the top and I turned around and I saw the entire stadium. I can still see it today, filled with people cheering. And that was it. It was that moment when you said, we did it, even though we've had amazing moments since. But that really was the zenith, I think, at the time.
And like we said, though, it is incredible. Here you are 40 years later playing stadiums right now in Europe with a couple of weeks off. But
Right. It's still, I guess that's the amazing part is you can go out as we just have and you walk up on stage and you see all the people out there. You look at the faces of the crowd and little kids with signs that say, "This is my first E Street Band concert." And then you see parents or you see young people in their teens, young people in their 20s and 30s. Then there's millennials and Gen Xers and Gen Z. It's the cross section is so fantastic to see out there. It's not just a small group, a small demographic. It's so wide that it's such a beautiful thing to see. You realize how Bruce and his songs and his performance can touch people of all ages and the band. The band brings yet another dimension to Bruce's artistry. There you have it.
yeah, man, I think I most recently saw you guys at that Mohegan Sun show, and it was really fun. I saw it last year. It's really fun to see the set list loosen up this year.
Yeah, it's great. It's always been interesting playing a set list when he has something particular he wants to do, but it sure is fun to mix it up. And look, when he has a songbook of 300 or however many songs he has, it's a shame not to be able to even play more.
Well, listen, man, I won't keep you, but always a pleasure. I think people will enjoy hearing that look back.
Thank you. It's, as I said in the beginning, it's amazing to be sitting here and talking about this so many years later, and amazing to be continuing to do it.
So that was the great Roy Bittan. And next, here is Max Weinberg talking about the making of Born in the USA. And I should note that I barely had to ask any questions. It's going to sound a little bit like a Max Weinberg audiobook, which honestly is all the better. Again, here's me and mighty Max Weinberg. We've spoken about it in detail before, obviously.
You did, yeah.
But
Well,
yeah, but just looking at September 1981, you guys get off the road. That's when you finish the River Tour. And Bruce, as you said, basically went into seclusion, turned out he was recording all these acoustic demos through the end of that year, some of which became Nebraska, of course, somewhere in there. And then the first time that you all got together was in Roy Bittan's living room.
yeah, I had stayed at his house during that period between one of the house they had at the time in Los Angeles after the River Tour and before we got together to rehearse all the songs he had, which were all the Nebraska songs. He moved around a lot in those days. We did rehearse finally at Roy's house or in the living room for a couple of, I don't think it was more than a week. And he had all the songs that he had on the demo that he played for everybody, which was Nebraska. And also working on the highway. And I still do have it, a professional Walkman when they first came out. It had the two little microphones. So at that time, I couldn't read music. I can now. So I used to record all of our rehearsals, and I still have those. Everything's on a hard drive now. I remember I went to Jamaica for a month. Right before that, just hung out on the beach for a month with my wife, Becky. And we got back and he convened these rehearsals. Went very quickly, but I remember working on the highway very similarly to it, the way it came out on the Born USA record. And I remember it was Steve's idea to do the drum part that I did, which the country, That was his idea. And I have that all on tape. And those versions, including Murder Incorporated, which was on that tape, and it wasn't a full version. It was really interesting because Bruce started playing the riff to it, which is how all, in those days, it still does pretty much, but in those days, here's the riff and everybody just played along. And on the tape that I have, he starts to down, 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 and Clarence starts hitting a cowbell note, and we just fell into it. And he didn't even have the complete song, but I remember it being so much fun. With those little Walkmans, everything is so compressed. It sounds like a record. It's all just loud. And it was one of the greatest versions of that song. But we had all the band worked up material that we had on Nebraska, which is what we went in, I think it was the first or second week of April, 82, to record, which we did, all of it. The interesting thing to me about the sort of legend that has grown up around that material is that it wasn't very good. It's actually incredibly good. It was just completely wrong for what he wanted to do. But at the time, I'm not quite sure he didn't realize what he had. And Steve and John, of course, were very important in, I think, giving him and Chuck Plotkin, who figured out technically how to transfer it. And I remember recording all of that material, and it was very much in the E Street Band style and very similar to what we do now when we play those songs. And it was great. And it was a rock record. And of course, none of us knew what he had in the back of his mind that was slowly moving to the front of his mind, because we were giving it our all, including him, recording all that material. And I can recall one night, there must have been a discussion with Steve and John, and I guess Chuck, and they had a little lounge, very small, at the power station. Bruce came out and said, "Oh, boys, we're going to try something different." And he had all these other songs that he'd sit in the corner, work on it a little bit. We'd come in, and that became 8 of the 12 songs that ended up on the finished record. And of course, we recorded probably 60 or 70 further songs over the next 14 months or so in various configurations in the studio. I think there was only one time at the end where the bulk of the E Street Band was in the studio. I should say the rhythm section, really. I don't think Clarence was there when we recorded No Surrender and Dancing in the Dark, in my recollection. And that was at the the old Hit Factory on 54th Street near, between I guess it's 7th Avenue and 8th Avenue, which is no longer there. That was a great little studio on the 5th floor. There was another time where I remember I had these, one of the things, I'm sure it wasn't, for me, it was very crucial, was I had this tendonitis problem in my hand, and I had to have these several consecutive operations. Every time I had an operation, it stopped. The expedient thing would have been to get someone to play the drums, but Bruce wouldn't hear of it. And we waited until it took me about 6 weeks each time to be able to play. One of the times I was staying at his house, there were 2 bedrooms, and mine was next to his. And late at night, I remember him writing, and I could hear literally through the door writing My Hometown on his acoustic guitar. And that I remember distinctly. But when he came to record it, I think he'd done it with a Lindrum, just with the beat that ended up on the record. But he wanted me to replace the drum machine, which I did. But I had a cast on my hand, my left hand, because of the operation. I wasn't ready. It was a sudden recording. It was only me. I was the only one there. And I overdubbed to what he had, at that point, pretty much laid down in his house.
One of the earliest examples then of a song that was recorded more in the way that he would often do going forward. It wasn't a band take, essentially an enhanced demo.
Yes, that's right. One of the important things was, and John Landau bought Bruce a Lindrum, which was the sort of first really, there were rhythm machines out there, but the Lindrum was programmable. And they never really got into the programming bit of it. It was just a simple rock beat, whatever it was, very simple rock beat. It wasn't like they went into what became drum programming, actually became a career for drummers who had more of a proclivity towards electronics than actual drums in the 80s. And so I just replaced that. The only thing I did different was where it went to the bridge, I went to the cymbal and the side stick. Yeah, I was the only one in the actual studio part of it, overdubbing the drums. And I think there were a variety of everybody's on it. but we didn't do it all together. And prior to that, up through the end of the recordings in 1982, in April of 1982, it was always all of us in the studio. In other words, we went in and the idea was to capture live performances. So everything was done with all of us playing. And even Clarence, who generally overdubbed his sax solos, was there. He might be playing a tambourine or a cowbell, but Steve played acoustic guitar, isolated. He was in an ISO booth in the Studio A of the power station. One of the great things about recording at the power station back then was they had, on the top floor, they had a garage. So you could park your car there. And then believe me, that was a really big advantage for all of us were driving in from New York. I think Bruce stayed sometimes in the city, but they started just coming out one after the other. We tried Born in the U.S.A. it was almost like a country trio thing. I know we recorded it that way. And I think I did tell you the story of just the final version of that, which was unbelievably spontaneous. And it was very late at night, on a night where we hadn't been particularly productive. All those songs really came fast because, okay, I guess the discussion was, if you want to put out this very artistic, which it was, quiet, it wasn't what Columbia Records wanted after The River. They were for the next big, really big breakthrough rock album. And then I ended up writing, I have a feeling that sometimes in the 2 months or whatever that he stopped recording. I don't take credit for it, obviously, but it was a thing where he was writing. He wasn't recording, he was writing. It may have given him the opportunity to just keep writing. And because I remember he used to say all the time that for him, the process was, why do you write so many songs? He had to write himself out to get the album that he wanted to put out. It wasn't just a question of let's write 8 or 9, have him write 8 or 9 songs. Or in the case of the Beatles, they'd take 2 weeks and they'd write Rubber Soul and they'd write all the songs and record them and put it out. The process was really more, and he did it on his own because it was extremely expensive to rehearse in the recording studio, which basically is what we did. We would try things up through Born in the U.S.A., through The River. Almost everything was demos. And so it wasn't like when I tell younger musicians how we recorded those records, they can't believe it. It wasn't about, let's get a great track and then, we'll fix everything. And it was to get the performance. And he may switch, if you listen to the variety of ways we did a lot of the songs prior to Born in the U.S.A., that was the way we recorded. And in retrospect here now, as you say, 40 years, 45 years later, whatever, the River album, it was everything we did was demos, and first and second, and those were the ones that came out the most natural. And so Born in the U.S.A., those 8 songs, I don't have the album in front of me, but I remember very quickly, they were done really fast. He just said, it was just like he made a left turn and he had all these other songs that were not on Nebraska, that could have been on Nebraska. Downbound Train, but of course then he had Glory Days. But Cover Me, we did it wasn't in those original sessions, because the original sessions were at the power station where we got 8 of the songs. And then we moved over to the Hit Factory, and he was still doing demos, because I remember for the Born USA sessions, now you say the album, and people say the album because it came out and it's a package and there's the songs. But it was over a 2-year period where he would write songs. I remember he and I recorded the song None But the Brave, just the 2 of us. Huh. Else was overdubbed later on. I actually even sang on that. He was using anything he could use. And I was in the studio and he played guitar. He may have put a keyboard on, but I played the drums. Clarence was on the road with his band, the Red Bank Rockers. Roy Bittan was touring with Stevie Nicks. At that point, Steve was on the road with his original Disciples of Soul. Gary Tallon had moved to Nashville in this period where he was writing a lot. And the only ones who were living in New Jersey at the time were Danny Federici. But I can remember going up there and recording a bunch of stuff, just drums, guitar, and organ. But I do believe the last song, Dancing in the Dark, started out radically different rhythmically. I remember I may have talked about this with you before. I got a phone call from Bruce very early one morning to come over his house. I lived about 8 minutes away. I went over there and went up to his workroom in the house he had at the time, and he played me Dancing in the Dark on the acoustic guitar. We went in that night and recorded it. And at first, I was playing it very much like Born in USA, lots of drum fills, it was a real rock song. And John Landau, we did 2 or 3 takes like that, and they were rocking. They were really good. He came over and said to me, I took my headphones off. He said, try this like a Michael Jackson record.
Beat it,
And
you said, yeah.
Yeah, Thriller or Beat It, and which I knew what he meant. Just a lot of people think that's a drum machine. And that's me. That's just me playing like a drum machine. And that was the idea. It was a dance pop record. And that was after the famous quote unquote discussion they had about I Don't Hear a Single. And that became a big single for Bruce. And but the band we were on the Born USA sessions, we were really tight. And I personally had gone through a period of intense redefining my drumming style, my approach to drums, which up on that record, without a doubt, every track, if you contrast it to The River, that's a whole other book. It was very important to the way we were recording. And that was Born in USA, that first 8 days of it, 8 or 9 days, whatever it was, where we got those 8 tracks. On that record, that was the last time except for No Surrender, where pretty much the whole band played it. But of course, Steve was not there for the last 4 songs. First 8 songs, and that summer when they were finished, the summer of '82, when they were finishing Nebraska and figuring out how can you take this beat up cassette tape and actually make a record out of it. That's what the summer was spent doing. I wasn't involved in that. So Bruce was recording the Nebraska stuff. John Landau, during the writing of that, called me and suggested that I listen to John Wesley Harding, Bob Dylan record.
Yes.
And he said, yeah, Bruce seems to be going more in this kind of direction when we go into the studio. And there were some takes like that, brushes, very kind of just bare minimum rhythmic approach. And there was also rock versions of the Nebraska material, which that became a thing. And my reaction was, I could always put drums on that, Bruce, on the demo. But it was perfect as it was. And it was so pure. That's really the hard thing to get in. And I'm not even sure with the majority of people make records today that it's even a thing anymore. But to get that kind of pure and connection right away, it's hard enough to do by yourself. It's virtually impossible to do it with a band. That's what's so special about the E Street Band, is that we fall into those things. So yeah, after the first 8 days, I thought I was done. They went to work on Nebraska. After the production stuff of Nebraska, Steve went off and did his first solo album, which I played on. He put the Disciples of Soul together. So after that April of '82, he was out of the picture physically. I don't know what else was going on, but he was definitely not there for the Dancing in the Dark sessions, I'll call them, which were the last stuff that was recorded for the album that became Born in the USA. I do remember the thing, though, which we may have probably talked about, was there was one night I forget what studio it was at, but Bruce had lined up all these, and I happened to be there. I'm not sure if the whole band was there, but he had lined up all these potential album covers, and almost all of them had his face. Of course, the one they used, Andy Leibowitz's shot, was the one from behind. And my comment jokingly was, I like that one because that's the view I always have. And I don't think it made any impact. Everybody laughed. And then to pick that shot, and it just was a steamroller after that. It just was a juggernaut. But I remember saying to myself anyway, in terms of approaching recording all of those songs, every time I sit down at the drums, it's going to be the best I can do. The period after I really started this woodshedding, it was almost similar to when Derek Jeter had a batting slump and they sent him down to the Lakewood Blue Claws from the Yankees to relearn how to hit. I did that, got various drum teachers, and started all over again. And it showed up on the Born USA album in terms of the drum performances, let's say. I'm on Fire, that was strictly I think that was the first take, the only take. And there was no bass on that. I don't even think they did put a bass on it. It was me, Roy, and Bruce, and he wanted it really quiet. And I played a side stick 2 and 4 with eighth notes on the snare drum with a brush, very country-like. In fact, and I didn't quite know what to do with the bass drum. And if you listen to the record closely, in one of the opening, I think it's in the first 4 bars, the bass drum is a half note, boom. I think my pants got caught. Beater, there's a little screw on top. So I missed one of those beats. And I can remember we went in and listened to it, and Bruce was like, expletive, man, that thing rocks, even though it was so quiet.
Yeah.
That was action was it really rocked, but it was such a gentle, delicate, quiet approach to that particular song. And that was something for me, it was a very different way of playing. That record kind of it was the first time I really was satisfied with what I played on, except maybe the outtake of Ramrod, which was fabulous, but which not the outtake, but the take on the river. But the Born U.S.A. album for me was where I really felt like this was the proof of in 1970 when Bruce and I, it was a monologue, it wasn't a dialogue. Here's your marching orders. And I took that seriously. And I was 8 years old. I'm 73 now. And everyone's nickname for me has always been Mr. Self-Improvement on the drums, always looking for ways to play better. And it was a wonderful thing that Bruce on the River album, he was into, these are my guys. In Born USA too. This is my band. These are my guys. And on a lot of those songs, that Country Fair, Man at the Top, some of that stuff was recorded just with me providing a kind of drum machine-like backing to him doing it in the studio. He wanted the live person thing there, even if it was only one or two of us, because people were not around. As he said, Bruce said many times, the E Street Band can make anything sound good. That doesn't mean it's a great song. So when he got into this thing of if I'm satisfied with it on piano and voice or guitar and voice, then it's a good song because you can ornament and filigree anything. But if you can just do a thing like the beat, the big drum sound was prior to that. Phil Collins had the big drum sound. Led Zeppelin did. There weren't too many other rock records that had that. And that was Bob Clearmountain. The original mix of Born in USA did not sound anything. It wasn't a Bob Clearmountain mix, and it did not sound anything like what eventually came out.
And it was Bruce who wanted that giant snare sound, according to Bob. I assume you were down with that as well, of course.
What happened was I had done a record with Roy and Gary Talent in 1978, I think, or 77, maybe 79, with Ian Hunter and Mick Ronson. The power station wasn't even finished being built. And Bob Clearmountain was the engineer on that. And prior to that, so Ian Hunter was the first rock band that recorded there. Everything else before that was disco and dance pop records in Studio A. And if you put the drums in Studio A, my drum set stayed set up in Studio A for 19 months when we were at the power station. That was for the River. And you could, it was pretty simple in retrospect, take the drums out of a drum booth and you're going to get a reverberant sound. And it was such a good studio. It was all wood. It was very different sounding than a lot of studios. And the sound of that came not from the close miking, but from two, I believe, out-of-phase microphones that Bob had all the way in the ceiling. And the ceiling there looked like it was like a dome, but it was weird. There were no right angles at all. But it wasn't like a spherical dome. And I think that had a lot to do with the sound. And we were always trying to get that. We were always trying to get the sound of the Raspberries drums, the band, the Raspberries. Overnight Sensation was the template for how do you get that drum sound? And I had done several other records before I met Bruce. And I guess I just didn't feel I had the standing to take the drums out of the carpeted drum booth where there's no resonance and put them in the middle of the room, which I had done before. I guess I should, in retrospect, it would have saved us a lot of time. I just didn't feel like I had the standing at that point. And of course, then the Beatles started that sound, the real dead kind of thing. And that became a thing. Obviously, if the Beatles were doing it, to my recollection, the first time you really heard like a reverberant drum sound in the late 60s, that's all you heard in the 50s was Good Times, Bad Times, where you actually heard the sound of the drums and you could feel the drummer instead of this dull thud. Now, we've certainly gotten back to that. Now someone told me the snare drum on Born in the USA was one of the most sampled drum sounds in history because it's isolated. It's just vocal and snare drum in the beginning and the big synth. And that recording session. I think I've told you this before. That particular song, I went home just on cloud nine. And as a matter of fact, I got a knock on my door about 10 o'clock in the morning, and it was Bruce. who I think was on his way home from New York. And I'll never forget this. I had a boombox. He had a cassette tape. The record wasn't done. And my wife, Becky, made us, the three of us, some fresh squeezed orange juice. I used to have Bruce had rented this little cabin above Sandy Hook Bay, and he moved out and I moved in. I eventually bought it. It was like a little A-frame with an incredible view of New York Harbor and the Verrazano Bridge. And I have this vision in my head of us sitting on my deck at a redwood picnic table with the boombox all the way up, drinking freshly squeezed orange juice, listening to Born in the USA, and Bruce basically saying, that's what I'm talking about. This was going from the mental space of Nebraska to what that literally two chords and the truth. The album itself took on a life of its own, which was really fun. It was just fun for me. I can't imagine being literally at the Bruce and being at the center of that incredible maelstrom. But he was ready for it because we had been basically a pretty kind of parochial suburban band up until that point. I was 33, 34. It was fun. I remember those days it was interesting. It was fun. And the last night of the Born USA tour, I knew it was over. And we had a party. Bruce had a party for everybody at the hotel we were staying after we played the LA Coliseum. And it really did feel like the end of something. And as it turned out, it was. But that has nothing to do with the record. It was fun seeing those 7 singles just climb the charts and the reaction to people and 10 nights at Giant Stadium in the round.
Beatlemania moment, really.
Yeah, we called it Boss Mania. And we were a lot older than the Beatles, and it wasn't as big. It wasn't as the Beatles, as we've talked about, and I will always tell any young person who I meet, the Beatles was like the creation of the internet or the invention of the cell phone. There's never been anything like the Beatles. Yeah, it was our sort of Boss Mania moment, and I can't emphasize enough how important Steve was to the rhythmic thrust of that, of the songs that eventually came out. His acoustic guitar, which I was listening to a lot as we were recording, provided a very similar framework as Keith Richards on, say, for example, Street Fighting Man. The acoustic was super important, and Bruce and I were set up across from him. There's about 30 feet between us. He was behind glass. They call them gobos. They're like a big door of glass. He was on one side of the studio. I was on the other. Everybody else was in these isolation booths that are around. It's a nice thing about the power station then. I think it's still there. You could isolate what you needed to isolate. But the drums in that spot where those drums were set up for Born USA, they stayed there for the river, I think 19 months. But we found the spot. Neil Dorsman was the engineer, and we found the spot in that room where we moved the drums around a bit, but it was right by the double doors that went out into the lounge. And when you went in, you had to maneuver your way around the drums. But playing in that studio was effortless for me. It was the greatest drum sounding studio I ever played in. And still, I actually did something there with my son about 4 years ago, and it's the best sounding drum room I've ever heard. Anything sounds good in there. A trash can will sound good in there.
What stands out in your memory of the night you recorded the Dancing in the Dark video? It was at a concert, obviously, in St. Paul, I believe.
Yeah, it was actually, most of it was recorded before the concert. It was recorded the night before as a real Hollywood sort of production. They brought in about 500 people, and we did it over and over again. I had headphones on. I was playing to the song.
Right.
It wasn't even like a click track or anything. We never used that on any of those records. You can tell we lip synced, but it was a real Hollywood production. They got all their establishing shots. They put the 500 people behind us. Then they put them in front of us on the side. Over a night, it was like a 10, 12-hour day before the first show. And during the first show, they did it again with a full audience. Courtney Cox was there, and we must have played it 15 or 20 times in a row. But what do I remember? I remember I was wearing a really cool looking paisley shirt, but it was made out of wool, and it got wet and it itched like crazy. And I had to play, and I'd never done this before. I had to play, but I had to play to the record. So it was a little odd. Basically, we did the Born USA concert. We stopped. We filmed it a couple of times, the same song over and over. And Bruce announced in the audience, we're going to make a video. And that's how they did it in those days. And Brian De Palma and his crew. And what was actually, and I'm sure it's come up in somebody's interviews, the next video we we did was Born in the USA. And that was done, I think, at the LA Sports Arena. And Bruce made a real point of telling everybody, don't shave, don't try to play to the record, almost to the point of don't shower. I want this to look so garage band looking. And what else do I remember about it? I remember I had the weirdest haircut I've ever had. It was almost like a Beatle, like a young Beatle haircut. It's quite embarrassing, particularly 50, whatever it was, 40 years ago. But it was, for me, it was, that record was a high point in my recording career. It still is, because I approached every song as if I'm going to give Bruce the best drumming he's ever heard. And I knew I could do it. And I did it. And the Born in the USA track is something that, you know, might not, on drum track, might not be everybody's taste, but it was me being my version of Charlie Watts. I think I talked about that. This was during my period of listening to everything to really dig into and expose what I loved about all this different drumming. And Street Fighting Man was a song I happened to be listening to. A lot of the band. In fact, is it Darlington County? I'm Going Down. That was Levon Helm all the way. There's a drum pickup I do going to the sax solo, which I had written the big beat. I was in the process of writing the big beat and interviewed Levon, got to know him really well, hung out, got to really examine his drum style. And he would do these eighth note, that was stuff that I wasn't doing. I was doing a much more Englishy kind of 16th note drum rolls and things. And on I'm Going Down, it's one of my favorite, it's a bar. It's one bar. It's one of my most favorite bars of music I've ever played. And the beat is da-da, boom, 1 and 2, 3 and going into the next bar. There's Roger Hawkinisms in Born in the USA and on the album, and trying really to live up to the standards that the great drummers who I admired. And that was the first record in my entire career where I felt I was making a dent in that goal. And it's still beautiful moments and they were very spontaneous. The breakdown in Downbound Train, we're going to go back into something. So there's a little drum pickup that was perfectly placed with Bruce's vocal. We were so in tune in a Zen sort of way. We were so in tune with the vibe between us because I was directly across from him. I don't remember the lyric offhand, but there was a moment like that on the river going into the first chorus. We go down to where I did this pickup, and those are hard to time because it's out of time and you have to connect with the singer. That was the first record that I played on where I got the stories that were in the lyrics. And the drums became a background. Except on Born in the USA, the way he explained it to me on the porch that day, drinking orange juice, was the drums and the fills were the perfect counterpoint to the story and the sort of confusion of that era and the war. And it was bombastic. The drumming was very bombastic, and nobody directed me to do that. It was like me doing, what would Charlie do? The two things I got recently were just the drums of Born in the USA, to hear the inner stuff that I was doing. Drum gates had just been, fortunately on that, Bob Clearmountain, he mixed it without using gates. Gates became the gated snare drum sound became a very popular thing after that record came out. But all of that, because the groove of that, the rhythm of that, you have these inner beats that are called grace notes. And they're like, the drumming, they call them drags or flams. And they're softer than a hit. It's not just boom, bop, boom, bop, boom. You get all this inner stuff. And that got lost in 80s drumming largely in the middle and late 80s. But it was still on that record because you can hear that when I slap it down. That studio had a lot to do with just me, playing on those 8 tracks that came out at the power station. And if you listen to Dancing in the Dark or even No Retreat, No Surrender, Bob Clearman did a fantastic job of matching the bigness of the sounds.
Listen, the title track, that's one of the greatest recorded rock and roll drum performances ever by anyone. I'm sure you know it'll live forever.
Listen, it's not for me to judge, but if people look at it that way, I'm very pleased. Still, when we're on a little bit of a week hiatus here, but it's so exciting to go on stage and play for the people who know the music, appreciate the music, and now we're mixing it up a lot, so you don't know what song is coming next. And to be our age, in our 8th decade, is just such a blessing to be able to do it. Play with people you love, who are all so talented and tuned into what our fearless leader wants and needs without asking. That's the beauty of a band that's been together. Roy and I have been doing this basically as members of the E Street Band, except for our hiatus in the middle for 50 years. And it's a sixth sense. It's a very special place. But Born USA was real. It was a major turning point because you had Nebraska and then people saying, what? After the river, you've gotten, what is this about? All of us didn't even know where he lived. He was moving around a lot. I eventually was in all of the houses he rented, no possessions, pretty much, just in this very dark place, and got the same person writing Glory Days, and which is wistful in its own way with the rock backing. And I read where Bruce said no retreat, no surrender I thought at the time he didn't want to put it on because it was too idealistic, and convinced him otherwise that, yeah, but that's what we're about. There's a famous quote of Bruce's that I've always admired, and as I've grown older, really tried to embrace, and I want to get it right because it's important. How do you maintain your idealism once you've lost your innocence? And that's a Bruceism.
Yeah.
And managed to do it. That's a trick. And the magic trick he talks about. So to be a part of that for me and to be continuing to be a part of it is just the greatest honor and privilege of my musical life. No doubt about it. And I feel for me, Born USA, the album was my rock and roll bar mitzvah. That was the day I am now a drummer. Before that, I had the potential and I did some good things, some exciting things. One of my favorite tracks ever was Restless Nights, which was outtake, of course, and it was a lot of people's favorite outtake. It's not to say that, but I really worked at it as hard as I could none of us knew, of course you can't, knew how big that record would be, how big that tour would be, how big Bruce as an icon would become. To those of us who were, and I can say disciples, apprentices in many ways in the E Street Band, you had to be a disciple because in the beginning, there was nothing but talent. There's a lot of talent around. You were really not making much, you weren't really making a living. But there was a lot of idealism and there was a lot of, there's a phrase that the Beatles used to say when things got really tough. It's a famous phrase, where are we going? To the toppermost of the poppermost, they used to, when they were riding in a van together. And there was a lot of that in the E Street Band through the years with Clarence and Danny. And of course, Gary Talent's been there the longest. And you bring that into the music. That just doesn't happen when you call up the union. And I play with great union musicians, but that's the kind of thing where you work. You're playing your life up there. You're playing your life in the studio. Letter to You was really interesting because that was really the first time the entire E Street Band was in the studio together recording live since Born in the USA, that April of '82.
Well, funny, I was going to say, when I asked Bruce, because he was so pleased with that record and so pleased with everyone's playing and so pleased with the process. And Roy had made the case, don't demo it, do it the way you used to, just play us the songs and we'll pick it up. And he was just so happy with that turn. I said, look how well it worked on Born USA. Look how well it worked now. Looking back, why do you think, and there's a lot of factors, can you make sense of why you stopped that process and then didn't come back to it for so long? I mean, basically said, I don't know. No.
It was much more efficient, for one thing. And Bruce was evolving, obviously. You can minimize on a day-to-day basis, the absence of Steve and the studio were arranging the things that he uniquely brought. And he wasn't there. And again, the idea that if it's a good song, it should be a good song without a lot of ornamentation. And so I think that had a lot to do with it. Also, the ability of when we did the Brendan O'Brien records, all those songs that was done strictly rhythm section, bass guitar, drums, and keyboard, the four of us, and then everything else was added. And I love those records. That was a fun just doing with the rhythm section and Bruce. There's a lot of ways to skin the cat and make a record. And also you want to be spending 16 hours a day, 6 days a week in a studio with 4 or 5, 6 other guys banging it out and just trying this and that. And it becomes, after a while, if you're going to continue, you've got to evolve. And the beauty about the E Street Band, if you go from 1982 to 2019, we're all playing so much better that what used to take us hours, try this, try that. Bruce had the songs pretty much in his mind and arranged, and Steve was there to make suggestions. And are you sure? And it was really really like the old days. And I'm 3 feet from Bruce's little booth. Steve is right next to me. And I'm ping-ponging back and forth between these two guys in that whole Letter to You experience. And it really did remind me of the beginnings of Born in USA, what became the bulk of the album, and where the band really was the band at that time and really playing great together.
For years, whenever you talk about the quote unquote Electric Nebraska sessions, fans get very excited. And I always feel like we need to qualify things like My Father's House or some of the more obvious ballad songs. Those, I presume, were more in a John Wesley Harding. I presume there's no rock version of things like that, obviously, I would presume.
No, yeah, they were in this sort of, Buddy Harmon played a lot. Buddy Harmon, the great Nashville drummer, played a lot of the drumming on that record, and also Blonde on Blonde. So yeah, they were definitely in that vein. Johnny 99 did it several different ways, very similar to the way we play it now. And then when he had his Seeger Sessions band, he did it another way, a rock version with a Dixieland kind of bent to it. It's a good song, it'll last. And he went in to make a kind of, not a river type rock record, but the next kind of record. Nobody expected Nebraska. Nobody at the record company, and then at the end of Born in USA, when John famously said, we don't have a single, you write it." That was a major thing. And if you listen to the words, it's exactly about that. I'm sick of writing this book, and all very organic. And so I think through the years, we have probably played everything on Nebraska live the way we recorded it. It was just different. It wasn't, some people will say to me occasionally, when, if I run into someone, "Hey, tell me about that." And I'd say, it wasn't that they were bad. It was just, they were boisterous. It wasn't a boisterous mood. I've heard Bruce give directions to producers. No, this is two guys sitting on a front porch talking. This isn't a priest in a large echoey church preaching to get a certain sound. Two people, or a guy sitting on a front porch with his guitar, very conversational. And you have to know what he means.
Yeah, it's actually, looking back, insane how much was produced. When you look at both what's on the record and the outtakes, particularly Darkness through 84, the productivity, the number of songs, it's mind-boggling. It truly is.
Yeah. It's like he's writing a great record every day. Sitting in that room by himself with a coffee table, a pencil or a pen, a notebook, his guitar, and that's it. And if you walked into his dressing room at a concert now, it hasn't changed.
Seeing you on this tour, I'm always trying to be aware of that in some ways you have the hardest job. The drummer has the hardest job on stage. And it's been amazing to watch you in the shows I've seen. Cold aside, how are you physically holding up?
Yeah, actually, myself, I am, because we were planning on touring in 2021 and 22.
Of course,
not consecutively, but COVID interrupted all that. So I knew that. And I had 6 months to start physically training with a trainer. And once those tours got canceled, I just kept drumming with my little side projects and training with this trainer 4 days a week. So by the time we actually went on tour in February of 23, I was 70. I'm in the best shape. I was in the best shape I'd been since I was in my 20s. I was doing high intensity interval training with some weights, and I don't even get tired now. I've met some of my son's young drummer friends who have seen us play, and they're in their 20s and 30s. And how the hell do you be able to do that for 3 hours? I'm wasted after 40 minutes. I said, when you get to be 73, you'll figure out how to be able to do it for 3 hours. And I'm efficient at it. But I am in good shape. I watch what I eat. I'm very focused on the job I have to do. And I always say, people say, "Oh, you got the hardest job." Any drummer would say that, well, you are the sort of white line down the center of the road. And on the other hand, when you're playing with someone who's got like a catalog of 800 songs, I don't have to learn the chords. And rhythmically, Bruce's music rhythmically, it tends to be pretty a constant type of thing. It's simple, but it's not easy. But again, I don't have to remember chords. So
that's true.
And this is what I do. If you see us after a concert, everybody but me is sitting down. I'm standing up because I've been sitting for 3 hours. The other night in Sunderland, England, it was freezing rain on all of us because the wind was pushing in our direction. So everything was wet. The cymbals, it looked like that Jay Giles video where they hit the drum and it was milk, or was it Jay Giles or somebody, I forget. I think it was Jay Giles. There was a quarter inch of water on all my drums. So it's pretty challenging. You look for those things in life.
And that's our show. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, subscribe to Rolling Stone Music Now wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us 5 stars and a nice review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, because that's always appreciated. But as always, thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next week.